It's almost certain that people the age of our children, for example, much less our grandchildren, will not experience the same kind of world we have experienced. You know, collapse of industrial civilization is right there on the horizon. That wolf is always at the door. And even if it's not, if we continue to spew carbon, and it's pretty apparent at this point that the methane gun has been fired, the clathrate gun has been fired in the Arctic Ocean. So we're headed for very abrupt warming. What does that mean in terms of how we live? I think it means that we live with urgency, that we live with love, that we live passionately. As the tagline says at Nature Bats Last, passionately pursue a life of excellence.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm in Grass Valley, California with Dr. Guy McPherson, who's a conservation biologist and professor emeritus at University of Arizona. Guy, thank you for joining me again.
Thank you for having me on again, Janaea.
We talked in February of 2014 about your message about abrupt climate change, actually is what it's become. And what I want to do is ask if you've been on the road sharing this for the last year or so. Can you give us just the highlights of what the science is telling us? But mostly I want to talk about how are people responding? It's tough news.
Sure, it's very difficult news, but it is reality. The current projections indicate that we're headed for a temperature beyond which human habitat will be available in the not very distant future.
What's not very distant?
Well, depending on whether we have collapse of industrial civilization, which causes the sulfates to fall out of the atmosphere that we've been putting into the atmosphere, and therefore get rid of global dimming, and then in addition probably triggering a 50 gigaton burst of methane out of the Arctic Ocean when the Arctic Ocean becomes ice-free, which is on track to happen this year.
I was going to say, they thought this year
it could very well be this year. I can't imagine we'll go more than a couple of years anyway without that happening. Well, that adds up, those two events combined add up to about 3.55 C above baseline, 3.5 degrees centigrade above baseline. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but we've never had humans at more than 3.2 degrees centigrade above baseline. And this time, that change would happen in a span of about 18 months. So much, much more rapidly than plants and animals can keep up, therefore than habitat can keep up.
So what you're saying is the bodies might hang in there, but if the habitat is gone, then we don't have the plants and animals we depend on to eat.
That's right, and as a result of civilization, we've been driving them to extinction at an astonishing rate anyway, and now we're in this double bind where if civilization collapses, that sounds like good news, and it is for all those species we're driving to extinction. But when it happens, it jacks up temperatures very rapidly to a very high level. And so I just don't imagine how humans can survive that. Now, that said, the general consensus among the scientific community is that it'll take till 4C to cause our extinction. But we've never gone extinct so far, so I'm not sure where you get the idea that we can survive 3.55 in 18 months as opposed to 4 in a few years. We're going to run out of habitat, and that's the key point here.
Yeah.
You know, we're human animals, and so like other animals, we rely upon habitat, and mostly that's the plants. And already with this simple linear change in Earth's atmosphere and Earth's temperature that has been going on, with just that simple linear change, the change is occurring 10,000 times faster than evolution by natural selection can keep up. So there's no way for the plants and the animals to keep up, to migrate, to keep up with that very rapid change. And what we're talking about in the not too distant future is a very, very abrupt rise in global average temperature instead of this relatively gradual change. You know, without habitat, eventually we're done. Somebody might be able to live in a bunker with food and circulated air and so on for a few years, as if that's living.
Doesn't sound real appealing.
But it won't last long, and so ultimately, according to an expert on Arctic methane release, Paul Beckwith, we're headed for 5 to 16 C temperature rise in a decade or two. That was a statement he made in late November 2014. So I think at the very outside, what we're looking at is a 5C rise in 20 years. That's the most sort of conservative estimate we can come up with. And so, you know, we might have until November 2034 with Habitat for Humans. But it would surprise me because things are picking up in pace.
I'm seeing that there's more news about that, and I want to ask about the responses of the scientific community. It seems to me that I'm hearing more from the IPCC or other scientists that corroborate. I mean, you've been kind of a lone voice out here crying in the wilderness.
That.
And I mean, the blessing is you haven't been trying to hold a job that, you know, so you've been free to, if you will,
Right.
to be a maverick.
Right. I'm not particularly bound by the shackles of culture like most people are.
But I think that so tell me how the rest of the scientists, some of the rest of the scientific community are corroborating what you're seeing?
Well, it's still a very, very difficult road for a mainstream climate scientist to go down. I mean, they draw a paycheck too, and so saying anything that is contrary to this culture is a tough sell. So Michael Mann, one of the two most famous climate scientists in the world, along with James Hansen, recently in an interview with Tom Hartman, concluded that we need to keep burning coal. The dirtiest of the dirty fossil fuels. We need to keep burning coal because that's what provides us false sulfates that allow for global dimming.
Oh my.
So obviously we need to keep burning coal, but along the way we need to figure out how to extract that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Well, that's just sheer absurdity, obviously.
Wow.
But he knows, Michael Mann knows, that even collapse of industrial civilization at this point takes us beyond the absolutely ludicrous political target of 2 degrees C. It's never been a scientific target, although scientists have been very slow to catch up to that message.
In your bringing this message to folks, what kind of responses are you hearing from people?
The full range, and I used to get a lot more resistance than I do now. I used to get, every time I'd speak, there'd be somebody in the room who would accuse me of being the leader of a death cult, apparently not recognizing what civilization is, which is a death cult.
A death cult, yes. It's just, but it's a civilized death cult, right? And it's sanctioned.
And it's our civilization,
and
so it must be okay.
Sure.
At least he's our uncle, even if he is a jerk. Right. So,
right.
So now there's not so much pushback. Now, many people in the audience, I'd say on average 10 to 20% of the people in the audience are familiar with my work and familiar with the idea of abrupt climate change and understand that the car has gone over the cliff, and so there's no backing up, there's no slamming on the brakes at this point. Another 10 or 20% are in the denier camp, but not denying climate change or even anthropogenic climate change, rather denying abrupt climate change.
Okay.
You know, sort of negotiating with,
Yes.
well, if we recycle and if we reduce emissions and we all drive electric cars and we do all these things, then surely we haven't triggered that yet.
Yeah.
But typically 70 or 80% of the people in the audience are familiar with the idea of anthropogenic climate change and have accepted that notion, and they just didn't know it was this bad. They didn't know that we had triggered abrupt climate change. And so most people are stymied, surprised, interested in the message, but most people at this point don't really resist very much.
That's a change.
It is. It's a big change in 2.5 years.
We've been a part of two of your presentations, and I think we're stunned. You know, and there's some, you know, how do you wrap your mind around this? But there have been enough changes, observable changes, that even that get through the mainstream media, that people are seeing evidence that corroborates your message here.
Yes.
So there's a validation happening.
Right.
Hooray,
When Paul Ehrlich, the renowned conservation biologist from Stanford University, goes on MSN and is interviewed and says he thinks there's a 99% chance that humans will be missing all habitat on this planet by the year, I think he said 2065, within 50 years or something
Okay,
like that.
all right.
You know, and of course the interviewer was shocked. A 30-something interviewer with great hair, and he was just, you know, absolutely shocked that that could actually happen. And now we have the likes of Paul Ehrlich indicating that, you know, we're teetering on the abyss here. He's not as radical as I am, probably because he isn't as he doesn't keep up as well as with that particular literature as I do. But still, here's a pretty mainstream voice. You know, the guy was on the Johnny Carson show,
Sure,
the Tonight Show, more than 20 times, and so he's been out there a lot. And so for him to come out and say, it looks like it's game over in the not too distant future, and still the mainstream media are like, what?
Yeah.
Wait, where'd this guy come from? Didn't somebody vet him?
Yeah, really,
So,
really. We
no.
don't, because it changes everything.
Yes.
This kind of changes everything in our lives. You and Carolyn Baker just co-authored a book called Extinction Dialogues, living with death in mind.
How to live.
How to live.
With death in mind.
All right, so.
An important distinction.
Thank you.
How to live is different than living with. Living with sounds like we surrender, that we give up. We're just living with it. We're just going along for the ride.
I think that a lot of people think that maybe, you know, what else can you do? You know, your recycling isn't going to make any difference.
Right.
You're not flying doesn't make any difference. The hell with it. Let's eat, drink, and be merry. That's one response.
Yes.
How to live with it.
Right. And so to the people who say, I'm encouraging hedonism, I have a couple of responses. Hedonism in America? How would I tell the difference? When does that start?
This is America. Look at the entertainment industry. Yes, we have hedonism.
Well, look
from
at
Hollywood.
everything.
Sure,
We have the world's
sure.
reserve currency. In my latter years of teaching at the university, I rarely encountered a student who hadn't made the obligatory trip to Europe by the time they showed up in college. So there's that. In addition to the hedonism aspect, a lot of people say, well, what's the point? Why don't I just give up? Well, there's several ways of addressing that issue. There's, what's the point? Well, maybe the point is not us. Maybe this whole thing, this whole planet that's been here for 4.5 billion years, this whole universe that's been here for nearly 14 billion years, maybe it's not all about us, since humans just showed up within the last couple million years, and our species showed up within the last 250,000 years, right? So maybe it's not all about us after all.
We tend to think that we're the pinnacle
Absolutely.
of evolution. And what you're saying is, well, we're just another experiment in evolution, another exploration.
Another evolutionary mutation along the way, or series of mutations along the way, that led to us with the big brains and the ability to corral much of the rest of nature to our bidding. But nature bats last. You know, we're not going to be able to keep this up forever. At some point, living as though we can have infinite growth on a finite planet with no adverse consequences doesn't pan out well.
Yeah. So I want to go back to how to live.
How to live with death in mind.
Because I think that's the core question for a lot of us is, how do I
Sure.
live now?
Sure.
When it looks like the future I thought I might have, and I'm thinking particularly for young people, the future I thought I was going to have may not be possible.
Right. In fact, it's almost certain that people the age of our children, for example, much less our grandchildren, will not experience the same kind of world we have experienced. You know, collapse of industrial civilization is right there on the horizon. That wolf is always at the door. And even if it's not, if we continue to spew carbon, and it's pretty apparent at this point that the methane gun has been fired, the clathrate gun has been fired in the Arctic Ocean. So we're headed for very abrupt warming. What does that mean in terms of how we live? I think it means that we live with urgency, that we live with love, that we live passionately. As the tagline says at Nature Bats Last, passionately pursue a life of excellence.
That phrase, Guy, the pursuit of excellence, is really, I connect that with you a lot. That seems to be your hallmark, one of your hallmarks.
Well, I stole it from Socrates, to be fair.
Oh,
You know.
okay. Well, then forget.
Who might have been a figment of Plato's imagination, for all we know. So I might have stolen it from an imaginary figure.
But a good thinker, philosopher that he was, stolen or not, you can steal it. It's okay. Steal with one hand. What do you mean by that? What does it mean to pursue excellence?
Well, there's a couple of things to tease apart here. First of all, it's a pursuit. Excellence is an ideal that I don't think we can achieve. So it's not something we can reach. It's like people often confuse the message. They say, live a life of excellence. For me, that's living perfection. That's beyond our grasp.
Yes.
But we can
yes.
reach for perfection. We can reach for excellence while knowing that we will always fall short.
Okay.
And excellence, what it means to pursue excellence is how we finish the workshop on abrupt climate change. We ask that question, what does pursuing excellence mean to you? Because it means something different for every person. What it means for me is to constantly question this culture that I'm embedded within. And in questioning, Socrates point out the absurdities of this culture that we're embedded within. So Socrates was known for pursuing excellence by asking those 6 famous questions in various forms. Right? What is courage? What is good? What is justice? What is moderation? What is piety? What is virtue? I'm asking a bunch of questions too. And this is what I was doing in classrooms, was asking questions. And then, when it really worked well, getting students to ask the questions
yes.
back.
Yes. So, you mentioned, and it went by quickly, you mentioned love, connection, and in your own response or in mine, what I'm finding is a lot of grief. A lot of grief, because that's tied in with love. I mean, I love the bird that's singing now and the pond behind us with whoever jumps in, and it grieves me to know that many of them are quietly going away, and the beauty that we have gotten to experience, connection between people,
Right.
is being diminished. I mean, that's industrial civilization at work. Abrupt climate change just brings that even sooner.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk a little bit about grief, because you're sharing more about how do we handle our grief.
Right, so I completed a grief recovery workshop with the Grief Recovery Institute in January of 2014, and then shortly thereafter went to a Dharma center in Winnipeg, Canada, where I was hosted by the Lama there, and did a series of meditations on death and dying. And I never formally meditated before. And so it was a singular experience, and to have those back to back was just wonderful in terms of informing my message and the way I present it, as well as informing my own philosophy and my own understanding of the way the world works. Grief is, one way of thinking about grief is to view it as a painful regret or attempting to complete an incomplete relationship. So for example, after I left active service at the university, I kept trying to connect with people at the university, and it was pretty obvious they weren't interested in connecting with me. But I didn't figure that out for a long time, and so I was having this swirl of emotions going on inside of me, and it took me until January 2014 at the Grief Recovery Institute workshop to figure out that what I was experiencing was grief. It was an incomplete relationship. I was trying to sustain this relationship that nobody else wanted to sustain with me. And so the relationship had become toxic because it was all me pouring myself into it and other people just turning their backs on me. So at some point I adopted the Zen Buddhist line, let go or be dragged. I couldn't be dragged along by this relationship that had become toxic anymore. It just didn't make any sense. So I let go. I let go of a bunch of those relationships, including with my family and my friends, because they were no longer respectful and supportive of my life path. And once I figured that out, once I realized that, I understood that they viewed me as a completely different human being than I had been when I was living the easy life, teaching at a prestigious university and making a lot of money. When I was that person, I was everybody's friend. And when I wasn't that person anymore, people didn't want to have much to do with me.
So grief, being an incomplete relationship, I know that some of the grief for you was what you were learning about climate change, and grieving those losses.
Yes.
Anticipatory.
That's anticipatory grief, that's right. So anticipating what's going to go extinct. But, we don't need to anticipate the extinction of the Panamanian golden frog. It's dead as a
already
result
happening.
of climate change.
Yes.
There's the families of the 5 million who die early deaths every year because of climate change. We don't need to anticipate their grief. But the hits keep coming.
Yeah.
There's no slowing down this train. It's a runaway train at this point. And so we can anticipate our own deaths. Nobody gets out alive. Right?
That's right. I mean, that's the bargain here. You decide you're in life, and death is the wrapping of that one out.
Absolutely. Birth is lethal.
There's your gallows humor.
The 6th stage
That's
of
right.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief is gallows humor. Yes.
You're on it. Although, as you reminded us, the grief, what we just tasted was a bit of the grief recovery workshop work that you had done.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us in my community got to get a taste of that. And I feel like that's something really, really valuable to offer to people who are stunned, who do not know where to turn, who may be paralyzed, who can sort of get it. This deepens it to realize, to share with others our losses in our personal life, that things that are incomplete.
Right. And what we do in our workshop is give people a set of tools that allows them to complete those otherwise incomplete relationships.
Yes.
And sometimes the grief is anticipatory, and sometimes it's real. So we start with examples of personal, concrete grief. The grandmother that died 27 years ago, and I never got to tell her I loved her before she died, that sort of thing. So we're all familiar with those kinds of examples of individuals.
Yeah.
Anticipatory grief is more difficult, although most of us have had somebody in our lives who we knew was going to die when they were on their deathbed, so we could anticipate that grief.
Sure.
So it's not a big shift to do with that. The scale part is hard, and so there we give examples like CAFOs, animals.
Confined animal feeding lots where...
Right, exactly, where it's horrific, or the Jews in Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. So there are a few examples out there of scale level, genocide level grieving. But connecting those to anticipatory grief at scale is the step that we're taking with this program, and allowing people to come to grips with the reality that it's not just you and it's not just me, but we all get to die. That, like every other species on the planet, ours is going to go extinct too. Why? Because we're going to run out of habitat. And that's the case for nearly every other species that has ever gone extinct, is they just run out of habitat. On a few somewhat unusual occasions, they're murdered by civilization. Right? But for the most part, it's lack of habitat. And we've driven ourselves to that same abyss, the lack of habitat option, which lurks in the not too distant future.
I think that giving people tools to both see what grieving is, and now this kind of grieving on scale, loss on this scale is a gift to us. I want to thank you for that, because
Well, thank you for saying that. We, as far back as the 1700s, a guy named Jonathan Swift pointed out the advantage associated with the fact that we get to die. In Gulliver's Travels, he had people who lived forever, and it was truly miserable. And this book was written in 1726, or was published in 1726, and he was pointing out that living forever is not all it's cracked up to be. And so that seems to be the goal of most people within civilization, but it's horrible. There are horrors associated with growing old. Things start to fall apart. And you lose the ability to appreciate moments, which are all we have.
That's the piece that I really get for this in closing, is the how to live with death in mind, as if it were any moment, any moment, any moment, is making the present as full, as loving, as rich, as appreciated.
Absolutely. Because this is what we have. What we have is right here, now. And there was no more trenchant reminder of that for me than and in the middle of this speaking tour, when I got to take a little trip to the emergency room and find out that I was just one blood clot away from not being able to walk around anymore.
How does that change your perspective?
It really doesn't.
Aha. That's quite a statement right there.
Yes, it is, because I, over the course of the last year plus, had come to grips with reality. And I know that the knock is always at the door, right? That we could go at any moment.
So it was sort of an early knock to just say, check you on
Sure.
that.
Yeah, but I've had many relatively short-term relationships with people because of this traveling I do and staying with people. None have been more hilarious and deeply meaningful than the time I spent in the emergency rooms.
Really?
Those people know how to live with death in mind.
Oh man, do they?
It's constantly
Every day,
over
all
their
the
shoulder.
time.
You
Whoa.
bet. So every minute of and they're hilarious about it.
Well, you know.
Because you have to be.
I mean, that's what keeps our spirits going.
Yes.
I mean, otherwise we drown. Yes?
Yes, absolutely. So you go to the emergency room and these people are all over it. One just minor example. I'm with a couple of nurses, we're filling out some paperwork, and we're talking about what I do. And I said, it appears that we're headed for human extinction, and not in the long term either. And one of the nurses turned to me and says, good. And it was just hilarious.
Oh my goodness.
We'd been laughing it up before then, and that was just the punctuation mark.
Stories. Thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you,
This has
Janae.
been
It's
a wonderful
It's a pleasure.
conversation, and I expect to be continued.
Let's hope we have that time.
Yes, let's hope. But in the meantime, thanks for this richness here.
And thank you, too.
You're watching Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm with Dr. Guy McPherson, and in the midst of grief, great joy. Join us next time.